Our final speaker is Francisco J. Galarte. Francisco J. Galarte is an associate professor of American Studies and Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at the University of New Mexico, where he teaches courses in Chicanx, Latinx, and transgender studies. He was born and based in Brawley, California, located in the Imperial Valley along the US-Mexico border, and identifies strongly as a transfronterizo, meaning that the borderlands inform his creative and scholarly projects. His most recent articles have appeared in publications including Aztlan, Journal of Chicano Studies, Chicana Latina Studies Journal, and TSQ, Transgender Studies Quarterly. He holds a PhD in Educational Policy Studies with a minor in Latina and Latino Studies from the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. Before arriving to the University of New Mexico, he was an assistant professor of gender and women's studies at the University of Arizona. While at the University of Arizona, he was a member of the Transgender Studies Research Cluster, TSRC, at the University of Arizona, a collective of faculty that is the first of its kind in the world that brings together scholars in transgender studies from various disciplinary backgrounds to foster cross-collaboration in the form of research, writing, and teaching. Please join me in welcoming Francisco.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. Let me get this off so you can hear me a little more clearly. So first of all, of course, I'd like to thank my co-presenters, everyone that's spoken so far. I've enjoyed being a student and a learner today with all of you, and also to the organizers of this wonderful event. I think the comments that I have or that I prepared are structured in a way in which I'm doing a combination of the various approaches that we've had today, both kind of having us think about what we do in the classroom, but also thinking theoretically about pedagogy as a concept. So I'd like to start off and say, you know, I have a PhD in education. I don't really do work in educational studies, to be quite honest. I have a PhD in education mostly because I had an advisor who felt like I was someone that needed to get a PhD. And education was a department, and I had an advisor who worked with me in relationship to my learning style, right? And the way that I moved through the world as a student and as a first-generation student with an undiagnosed neurodivergence, you know, all of those things, right? So this is like me being the first-generation student who ends up getting a PhD without necessarily really imagining themselves as a professor. And so education is the degree that I got, and I was very much trained to think about pedagogy in the Freirean sense. I share a birthday with Paulo Freire too, which is interesting in and of itself and might have kind of scripted the outcome here for me. But what I'm going to do first is I'm going to read a little bit from a piece that I wrote quite some time ago that appeared in the first issue of TSQ, Transgender Studies Quarterly. It's a keyword essay for pedagogy. And so I'm going to bring that back to life since it's been such quite a bit of time since I've looked at it, and then talk about kind of like failure, right? Like what it means to fail in the classroom and its inevitabilities, and then also think about the ways in which we might desire or might be erring on the side of a desire to assimilate trans into teaching and pedagogy. And assimilation itself has its own kind of very complicated history that is typically thought of more in relationship to citizenship, right, and immigration, but assimilation as a concept kind of becomes useful to think about the neoliberal project of taking up best practices, so to speak, around trans pedagogy. And so I say this, and I start with my kind of story as a first-generation student because, I mean, I think oftentimes who gets left out of the conversations when we talk about pedagogy is kind of like the students, right? What types of learners they are, what we imagine about them when they step into the classroom, and then also as teachers, what we imagine a text or a syllabus to even do. And so there's a way in which I'm asking us to think about both what we are imagining of our students and what they kind of come to the classroom with, and kind of letting that go, and then also letting go of the preciousness of the project of putting together a syllabus that aims to capture the end-all be-all, or you know, what your take on is on a particular subject or topic, and the mastery that kind of accompanies that outsetting or kind of undertaking that project. So as promised, I'm going to start with reading from my essay on pedagogy. So pedagogy, narrowly construed, is the study of teaching and learning. More generally, it pertains to the social construction of knowledge, values, and experiences. The common assumption that the classroom is the exclusive site where pedagogy transpires is challenged by educational theorists such as Henry Giroux, Antonia Darder, and Bell Hooks, whose definitions of pedagogy extended beyond the classroom, and who, like Paulo Freire, advanced the concept of pedagogy as a practice of freedom. Freire similarly redefines educator to mean more than a mere classroom instructor. For him, being an educator should encompass the multiple perspectives of, quote, border intellectual, social activist, critical researcher, moral agent, radical philosopher, and political revolutionary, unquote. Pedagogy, broadly defined in this way, engages questions of teaching and learning with questions of culture and power, of democracy and citizenship. It points to the multiplicity of sites, corporeal, spatial, temporal, and psychic, in which education takes place and where, most importantly, knowledge is produced. Transgender studies is a framework or lens through which to theorize the myriad ways in which people understand, name, experience, and claim gender in relationship to such other processes as racialization, class, nationalism, and globalization, needs to incorporate a critical pedagogical perspective. In the 2008 Women's Studies Quarterly Special Trans hyphen issue, Vic Munoz and Edney K. Garrison coined the term trans pedagogies. They sought to find a word to capture the dialogic relationship between trans subjects and pedagogical practices. They envisioned the term as a coalitional concept that encompassed transsexual, transgender, and genderqueer perspectives, through which an analysis of the production of knowledge could be linked conceptually to varying experiences of gender socialization or gender identity in diverse contexts. What might such trans pedagogy encompass? A pedagogical perspective on transgender studies should, at minimum, note that teaching and learning about transgender phenomena take place across a spectrum of social practices and locations, and that trans pedagogies are part of a broader public politics, not solely limited to what goes on in schools. But more expansively, a pedagogical perspective on transgender phenomena can also help unsettle historically and contextually specific knowledges that shape understandings of normative gender. Trans pedagogy should offer students the tools they need to participate in the political and economic power structures that shape the boundaries of gender categories, with the goal of changing those structures in ways that create greater freedom. In a transpedagogical approach, processes of learning become political mechanisms through which identities can be shaped and desires mobilized, and through which the experience of bodily materiality and everyday life can take form and acquire meaning. Trans pedagogies supply a discursive mode of critique for challenging the production of social hierarchies, identities, and ideologies across local and national boundaries. They represent both a mode of cultural production and a type of cultural criticism for questioning the conditions under which knowledge of gendered embodiment is produced. They provide a space for affective engagement, for the affirmation or rejection of values, and for the inhabitation, negotiation, or refusal of culturally prescribed gendered subject positions. Understanding pedagogy as a mode of cultural production in this way underscores its performative nature. It is how theory becomes practice. Stratagems of oppositional praxis are precisely what critical trans-pedagogical practices should aim to produce. They must shift the framework available for understanding, describing, and addressing the multiple and varying vulnerabilities to violence faced by transgender subjects. Paying attention to the highly variable and sometimes contradicting narratives of transgender subjects actually are used to describe and explain experiences as classist, racist, sexist, and ableist exploitation is part of a necessary pedagogical practice. It situates knowledge production in specific or local acts of knowing. Trans pedagogies must keep up with the continually shifting terms and conditions through which gender is named, imagined, and theorized, as well as with the ongoing neoliberal depoliticization of public life and the impoverishment of public discourse. Transpedagogical perspectives and approaches need to ask how knowledge of transgender phenomena is constructed through this absence as well as through its presence and circulation in the public sphere. Proliferating trans knowledges in the public sphere is only the first step of a radical educational agenda. The heart of an effective trans pedagogy, buttressed by rigorous intellectual work and political courage, is to link theory and practice to create new modes of resistance and collective struggle. So I read a few kind of excerpts from the larger essay, and the excerpts that I picked, I think, illuminate both my innocence, right, and youth as a scholar in terms of what I imagined teaching and learning can enact. And then there's me now, who 10 years later still fundamentally believes in a lot of these things, especially in thinking about my students as producers of knowledge and cultivating their experiences and what they gain from a text to kind of create a space of exchange. And then on the other hand, I only recently taught transgender studies for the first time this year. So being at the University of Arizona, where I had the company of other trans studies faculty, it was basically a competition. So imagine a world in which you had to vie to teach transgender studies. And being someone who also taught in Latinx and Chicanx studies, I more often than not was tasked with covering those kind of required classes. So in many ways, I was often split between trans studies, Chicanx and Latinx studies, and my embodiedness as a racialized trans person meant that I was fulfilling whatever that was kind of imagined to kind of look like curricularly. So now at the University of New Mexico, I'm the one that teaches trans studies. And so I wanted to give like some examples of what, worked and didn't work from that class. And then, for me, teaching that class was more so an affirmation and kind of a way to make sense of these thoughts that I put out there in the world in 2013, where I thought that all I would be teaching was transgender studies, that I would be able to use trans studies as a course to bring this to life. And I was able to enact a lot of these aims that I had in this essay, but in through general education classes and the other classes that I teach. And so what that illuminates to me is that by locating trans studies or intro to trans studies as like an exceptional space in which we aim to get students to want to enroll in that class, really kind of undoes the project here, right? Like we want to think creatively about how, as my co-panelists mentioned, right, like what is the threat of changing curricular aims, right? So what is it about changing curriculum that is so dangerous in terms of unsettling all of our disciplinary commitments and that involves like what we think is canonical to teach, what we must teach, right? I think curricular changes don't ask us to unsettle that. We're just being asked to enliven our pedagogical practices and how we imagine those concepts to make sense that are kind of standard or given in your respective disciplines of study. And so for me, I wanted to really kind of think or get at what what is it about teaching that creates a precarity and a danger in wanting to take up the challenge, right, of wanting to be experimental in how you might use gender as a analytical concept or as an animating force to like the set of text that you're putting together in a syllabus, right, or like the use words that we have to use our course objectives, right, our learning outcomes, right. So whatever we want to name it, what might that challenge be to enliven gender in different types of ways? And so for me, I went back into all of my sources on pedagogy, and I came back to this very early essay by Jose Esteban Munoz that is entitled "Teaching Minoritarian Language and Love," and it's published in 2004. And so in re-examining that, it really propelled me to home in on what I feel animates my own pedagogy and the desire to meet students where they are and move through their complicated relationships to text and also my own complicated relationships to text and the narratives that I'm trying to bring out in the course of a class or in a classroom space. So Munoz describes his pedagogy as, quote, shaped in part by a technique that is offered by Laplanche and Pontalis regarding countertransference. They suggest the option of the analyst as, quote, exploiting the countertransference manifestations in a controlled fashion for the work of analysis, end quote. He says, it often takes little to redirect this advice to the classroom and the scene of pedagogy. It is important to understand the ways in which the production of knowledge, and more specifically, the production of the desire for knowledge, is a two-way street. Failure in this enterprise is implicit, right? It's expected even, or perhaps a rite of passage for educators that we prefer not to talk about, right? So we like to think about all of the wins, right? Like all of the things that went really, really great in our classroom, and we don't often, scrutinize the failure or what went wrong, because it went wrong, we scrap it, we don't revisit it. But what would that mean to take on those failures and to interrogate them a little bit and to understand them that it's okay to fail in some context. Um, and so what Munoz is referring to is a showing of the themes of one's pedagogy, to lay bare what he says, this is his phrase that we all know, the here and now of pedagogy, which has everything to do with promise, possibility, and potentiality, but not necessarily an inevitability of failure. Munoz concludes his essay by referencing a meditation by Horton Spillers on psychoanalysis and race. And he does so to de-universalize the psychoanalytic tools he deploys to reiterate the stakes of what he's describing as a minoritarian pedagogy. So this is a quote that he pulls out from Spillers. Quote, it is not then the task of psychoanalytical protocol to affect the translation from the muteness of desire wish, that which shames and baffles the subject, even if its origins are dim, not especially known, into an articulated syntactic particularity. This seems to me as a passable psychoanalytic goal, but perhaps there is more to it than simply a nice thing to happen. At the very least, I'm suggesting that an aspect of the emancipatory project hinges on what would appear to be a simple self-attention, except that reaching the articulation requires a process, that of making one's subjectness the object of a disciplined and potentially displaceable attentiveness. So, according to Munoz, for Spillers, the psychoanalytical protocol brims with emancipatory potentiality in that it helps one combat the certain muteness that social logics like homophobia, racism, and sexism would project onto the minoritarian subject. Much like Munoz, the emancipatory project here is helping others come into their own, not only as speaking subjects, but also professing subjects. This is one of the ultimate stakes of Munoz's pedagogy, and now I realize my own, right? So what does it mean to have students come into their own as professing subjects and producers of knowledge? What does that look like in a classroom space, especially alongside the project of then the desire to compel trans narratives as the example of how to teach trans or how to teach gender in different types of ways. So this stake requires a teacher to examine their side of that two-way street. Why a trans pedagogy? From where does the desire to transform pedagogy emerge? The project must come from a place that does not solely wish to assimilate trans pedagogy into the folds of how you teach. And here I turn to very, very briefly to the concept of assimilation to reference how in the here and now, DEI projects increasingly require faculty and students to engage with trans politics or trans issues or phenomena, whatever we want to however we want to index that, suggests that we must engage this or take on these topics to be, quote, good educators. So here, I want to pause for a minute on Catherine Ramirez's definition of assimilation and her book, Assimilation, A History of Assimilation is an interesting text to turn to, mostly for me as I'm thinking through brown subjects, right, who are disciplined through schools in different types of ways in schooling, and kind of assimilation as a process that requires an absorption, that requires being compelled to take on that good role, to not be bad learners, to not be bad teachers. So Ramirez reminds us that assimilation has been, quote, used synonymously with civilization, through the early 20th century, as the opposite of savagery and barbarism, as a, quote, achieved social order or way of life, and as a modern social process whose effects are reckoned as good, bad, or mixed. Civilization is a conceptual precursor of assimilation as social and cultural process. So the assimilation of trans phenomena, practices, and narratives into one's teaching can dangerously come close to delineating the boundaries between us and not us, and is above all a pillar, and this is above all a pillar of U.S. U.S. nation making projects, and really kind of illuminates various relationships of power. So I come back to the question of why trans pedagogy, right? So there's, on the one hand, we're being asked to really kind of take the needs of trans students, right? And make sure that they can make it through a classroom and an experience in, college university spaces. But then there's also the why of, to what degree will you transform your curricular kind of aspirations or aims, right? So what my co-panelists mentioned in terms of these 5 areas that are delineated that are the easiest for an institution to do don't require an interrogation of your curricular investments, right? But when we don't interrogate the how and why, we don't want to change, right? Not only our pedagogical practices, but our intellectual investments in certain concepts and how we teach them, right? Like that's the question here for me, right? So like when there's that a critical interrogation in changing the outcome of discussing certain topics or ideas or sets of commitments in relation to discipline, if we're not willing to push at the boundaries or to go back to Munoz, to expose the seams, right, to lay it bare, then we err close to the side of assimilation, right? So how best can we absorb the needs and the central tenets of trans pedagogies into our own pedagogy, right? So assimilation is to absorb, right, and to literally have it become part of where the bit of trans gets lost, right, and is not visible, but then becomes very hyper visible at the moment in which we might have a situation that ends in failure in particular types of ways. And so for me, responding to this prompt really challenged me both because I had written this essay so long ago and what I imagined pedagogy to do. Now, as I am teaching different types of classes, I'm also reminded of what I was compelling myself and others to do in different types of ways. And looking back at my teaching, I see the different ways in which I was enacting this, but then coming to teach a trans studies class also really shows the ways in which, I wasn't necessarily always accomplishing that project, right? Failure was kind of a part of the process. And as I mentioned before, something that we don't often take seriously in kind of mapping out our pedagogical process and aims and goals, so to speak. And so for me, the goal for trans pedagogy is not to be the best or to be better at teaching trans, right? But rather learning how trans transforms my practices in different types of ways, or how I might be willing to transform my practices and my disciplinary commitments. So I'm going to stop there because I want us to have time for Q&A and I didn't